Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. This is our second event as part of our celebrations for LGBT+ History Month, and I'm extremely honoured to have these guests here. This panel is basically going to be about researching, working in LGBT+ history, and amplifying a history that's often neglected, ignored, and not paid enough attention. I'm going to pass on to the panelists who are going to be able to speak about it far better than I can for a brief introduction. Then I've got some questions, and if you have any questions, please do ask them afterwards.
Okay. Oh, good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm a Londoner, and I'm currently a health promotion specialist working around queer health and marginalised communities in a company called The Love Tank. The reason I'm here is because I've curated a digital archive called Black and Gay Back in the Day, which looks at black queer history through old photos from the 1970s to 2000. And I've produced a couple of podcasts which dive into the history of black queer life, but also the HIV epidemic through unheard voices. And it's a real pleasure to be here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Merryman from Kent State University in the United States. I am a professor in our School of Peace and Conflict Studies. I also was one of the founders of the first LGBT studies programs in Ohio, which was in the second cluster of programs anywhere in the world. And I believe that I was invited to join this panel because my work uses a lot of oral history and particularly ethnographic film, to give voice to people, including LGBTQ people. And from that work, I was asked to be the research director for the Queer Britain Museum, which is the UK's national LGBT museum in London.
Hi, my name is Justin Bengry. I convene the MA Queer History at Goldsmiths, University of London, where I'm also director of the Centre for Queer History. The MA Queer History launched in 2017 as the world's first postgraduate degree in queer history, and now it is still that. There should be lots of competition around. There should be 20 other degrees, but we're still the only one. But we get such exciting students, dynamic, vibrant, engaged students that explore so many areas of queer history, and for me it's like taking a new MA every year myself, which is amazing. My own research focuses on prehistories of the Pink Pound. I've also worked on the so-called gay pardons in the UK, and had the incredible pleasure to work with both Mark and Molly on different projects, with Rainbow Plaques in London with Mark, and the Queer Pandemic Oral History Project with Molly. So it's absolutely a delight to be on this panel with you.
Great, thank you so much, everyone. So my first kind of question is to sort of just kick off the discussion, and I'm sure go in different places, and we have some other questions, etc. The first kind of question is, often LGBT+ history has not been documented, or has been destroyed once documented, or has been sort of documented in a way that kind of erases that side of it. For example, framing a relationship as a friendship, for example. How do you, as researchers, and how in your work, have you found kind of working within the gaps in the historical records?
I'll take that from the...
Well, I think it's going into it realizing that many sources have been destroyed, and many sources have been destroyed by officials or never kept or made in the first place. And there's limitations on what we can uncover and what we can work with as historians. At the same time, we have to ask what other reasons are those sources and resources unavailable. And precisely because of danger and illegality, many LGBTQ+ people themselves had to destroy records of their own lives, of their relationships, of people they cared about, precisely to keep them from coming into danger. They would have to destroy address books, diaries, letters, for fear that the people they cared most about would fall prey to these dangers as well. So that's the first thing. Immediately we need to think about, why are these sources unavailable? And that becomes part of telling these histories, because that immediately begs so many other questions about the conditions in which people were living, the resistances, the resistance they put against that, how they circumvented it, sometimes when they asserted saving these sources or creating them in the first place, even in the face of those dangers. The creation of a source about your life, a record that tells your story, the story of your loved ones, is already a political act. And some people were doing that very decisively and very assertively as well. But that still leaves us with a limited number of sources. So as historians, we need to think about what other sources we can look to uncover more about LGBTQ plus lives and experiences. In the more recent past, we've all been talking about oral history, interviewing people, talking to them about their lives, getting insights into those possibilities about how they lived livable lives, how they built community, how they found possibility in the midst of all of this is absolutely crucial. So for all of us and for many of my students as well, basically creating a source by undertaking interviews is incredibly important. But I think we also have to be careful not to fall prey to the suggestion that this is a marginal history, these people are marginalized, it's true, and there's nothing out there really to work with, because at least for the 20th century in which I work, admittedly on fairly niche topics, I am overwhelmed by too many sources once I start going to the archive, and once I start thinking more expansively about what I can use to uncover these stories. I've gone through hundreds of thousands of pages of documents, and there's millions of pages more, let alone other types of sources that are not manuscript documents. So there is, in fact, a wealth of incredible resources and sources that tell important, dynamic, vivid stories, even as so many others that we wish were available to us may not exist.
Well, I would say for me, Justin mentioned oral history, and I think it's because of these absences that I really got interested in exploring oral history as a method, because I felt like I was very early in the HIV/AIDS crisis. I was a member of ACT UP, and there were times where you couldn't count how many funerals you were going to in a week, and those lives. Not only were the lives lost, but the stories were lost, and there was no one archiving. There was no one keeping the story. There was no one who was working on defining people as they defined themselves. And so when I became an academic, I wanted to be part of changing that and to really do what I could to elevate people's voices. And I think that one of my frustrations as a scholar is that often I work out of the social sciences, and there's this degrading of subjective realities. And I think that queer lives are very subjective. And then I think another thing that I got interested in, and it connected in with me being now working with Queer Britain, is the silences in museums. And this morning I went to the Imperial War Museum just outside of Oxford, that is the former RAF base. And so I was like, wow, it's LGBT History Month, let's see what I can find. Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. No targeted display, no mention, nothing. And we know that there were decorated pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain who were gay. I'm thinking of someone I interviewed, Caroline Page, who was the first openly trans officer in the RAF. She transitioned in 1996, and she served in Bosnia, she served in Iraq, she served in Afghanistan as a combat navigator. Her story's not there. And I would like to live in a world where we don't need queer museums, but obviously we do. When the museums refuse to or overlook including stories that matter of queer lives.
And I pick up on what both my colleagues have said here. I've approached this thinking about the hidden within the hidden and who tells the history. So there is some history out there. There are narratives and there are sources. but many people from even more marginalized communities, so people who are racially minoritized, people who are trans, women, and all those intersections are very often missing from the historic narrative, or even when we drill down into the sources. So my approach has been, particularly from a Black British perspective, because as a Black queer man, a lot of the stuff that I can pick up, I can go to the US and I can find an incredibly rich history going back to the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s. It's sort of in touching distance. But to look back at my own communities and our history here was really difficult to drill down and find out from. And I was really inspired by a writer and an academic, Dr. Gemma Romain, who did some stellar work on queer life in the UK and Black queer life, and that really took me on this journey. And I think using really simple methodology like oral history, like asking people to look within their own collections, understanding the importance of nightclub flyers or memories from those spaces, which we sometimes discount as just being kind of woolly and not valid enough. But I want to hear what happened to you when you went to a disco in 1972, because that tells me so much more. So it's about, for me, who's asking and telling the stories. What stories are we asking, and what value do we put on those stories, which then can become our primary sources.
Great, thank you all so much. So my next question is kind of specifically about this year's LGBT+ History Month. So the theme is #UnderTheScope, discussing contributions to healthcare, issues of healthcare parity, and the often under-acknowledged needs of LGBT+ groups. And we kind of spoke about this in yesterday's panel in the context of like trans lives, but today it's a more general question. So in terms of healthcare parity, do you think there are lessons from history that can serve us today? And kind of what can we change that's gone wrong with like HIV and AIDS and the way that these issues were treated, for example?
I'll start with that. I mean, I think first of all, that there is a lot to learn from our history around the impact of the HIV epidemic over the past 30 years. I mean, I think not just the medicalization of it or illness, but stuff like resistance from ACT UP, and how that has given us a pathway to queer resistance, to queer community building. But I think that what we need to do is expand the lens around how health has impacted all of our communities and how women who are queer are engaging in healthcare, and how poor ill health has played a part in that, how we've been pathologized over the years. All of these things need to be, so we need to take a long lens to think about where we are now. But I think a lot of the time our focus is on those past 40 years as our starting point, and also kind of maybe going back to 1950s, but that's it. So I think we need to take a longer lens to see where we've come to today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you use the language of pathologized, because I think there's a movement in history of criminalizing and then pathologizing. And so I think when we tell the story of queer lives, we're also looking at the stigmatization and being sort of named as mentally ill. And then I do think in queer communities, there's been a lot of really good intersectional work. So not only, the focus on HIV and AIDS, which began in the 1980s, but out of that came looking at the high rates of gynecological and breast cancer in lesbians. It came at looking at the high rates of heart disease and diabetes in the Black gay community, and really just recognizing that resources and access and feeling empowered to tell your doctor who you are. These all are important factors that affect our physical health. And then another thing I wanted to say, and then Justin can pick up since this was a study we did together, but when we came up with the idea of doing the Queer Pandemic Project, it was, as historians, when the pandemic started, we both were looking at historical records related to the flu epidemic of the 19-teens. And I had come across a collection in the Library of Congress that were oral histories. And it was really fascinating because you could see how the experiences of the flu for a former slave was very different for someone who was a dean at a college, and that was very different from a recent immigrant. And so all of these things were informing how people experienced the flu, what kind of risk they had, how many of their family members died, and all of that. And the group you don't see in the archives, even though I know they were interviewed, is distinctly knowing who was LGBTQ. And so we really wanted to establish the record so that in 100 years, when there's the next pandemic, that there are these really just, I think, carefully curated queer stories. And you see things like particularly the impact of being young and trans and how that was a very damaging experience during the pandemic. So we really wanted to look at not only here's the experience, this monolithic experience of LGBT people, but understanding that, again, your race, your age, your identity impacted how you negotiated the pandemic.
These issues that Mark and Molly bring up around criminalization and pathologization and medicalization, of course, dominate so many people's understandings of LGBTQ plus histories, whether they're LGBTQ or not, before they start doing further digging into it. And certainly the wider public, those are the stories that they're told, and they think that's the limit of those stories. Yeah. So I think these projects that we and many other people are involved in are so fundamentally important for breaking down those being the only narratives, especially those pathologizing and medicalizing narratives. And there is just so much more going on, of course. One thing that I was really taken by, I suppose, with some of the research and interviews that we did, and people like Mark and Molly would already knew about these from their community work and everything else, but is the kinds of communities of care that were also part of someone's wider well-being, not just the official doctor's visit, not just the official engagement with the medical health care system, but community activism and communities of care that did arguably as much for people's well-being. And that's something that was a big part of the Queer Pandemic Project, because of course, in a moment when proximity is dangerous, how do you maintain or reproduce those kinds of communities of care that could keep people going under all kinds of circumstances prior to the pandemic? So we really did ask people to reflect on what they had, what they felt they had lost to the pandemic in those ways, and how they were trying to rebuild it in the midst of the pandemic. Because a lot of our interviews were happening right through the middle of things and through different stages of the pandemic as well. And I suppose as a final thought, I'm thinking back to several interviews with people that did speak about the resonances of the crisis years of HIV/AIDS to the heightened moments of the pandemic. And there was very different approaches and very different perspectives. Two people that I interviewed come to mind immediately. One was he'd been a GLF activist. He was very active from the 70s and 80s, and this was the period of his sort of adulthood and coming into the person that he is. And he was saying that the symptoms of COVID and things like night sweats, the thought of the night sweats was very triggering for him and just brought him back instantly to the 80s, and worrying about possibilities and remembering those that he lost, and all the experiences and traumas that he experienced then came right back to him in COVID. I spoke to someone else who had been a doctor and found the experience of being a doctor during COVID so traumatizing. He's left the profession and is now engaging in another, but his experience was so different that he took a much more scientific approach, and to the question of whether resonances or their connections, he assertively said they're not. These are very different infections, and to compare them is problematic. And so, but he was maybe a generation younger than the first man and didn't have that same kind of first-hand experience in those years of the 80s and early 90s. So I think these questions bring up issues of what constitutes the kind of care, the kind of community that goes into healthcare and well-being, and how we build those for ourselves as well, and look back to the examples of our communities that have done that already.
And if I could just jump in really quickly, I think on the back of that, I think there's something else that we should do increasingly is look at look at the good that comes out of it. So you spoke about communities of care and how we resist, but I'm also really intrigued that in these periods of either a pandemic like COVID or HIV epidemic or criminalisation, what we create as a result of that, what comes out of that oppression, what is the art that we create, what is the music that we create, what are the social spaces that we create for each other, because those are made with love, and they're made with, they show the best of our humanity in spite of the inhumanity that's shown to us, and I think that that is a really, really rich part of our history. So if we look at the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, very often we'll see films or books or art which is about death, which is about protest, where we need to look, there is some real joy in there, there is some real celebration of life and holding on to the special things. So I think we can look at it through both lenses.
And so groups like the Black Gay Men's Advisory Group, ACT UP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, etc., were born out of collective action at a time when, like, the government was not acting, when like state-sponsored homophobia and transphobia basically neglected the community. How can we, or can you, in your role as a historian, kind of use this history now to, like, or is it your role, or like what's the engagement like to kind of pressure governments and bodies to make sure like this kind of thing isn't repeated and to galvanize social action nowadays?
Ooh. That's a big one. Let me think it through.
I think I can start with something that's really simple, that isn't fully getting to your question, but I think it's a simple entry in, which is that I think when we're collecting and preserving and sharing these stories, it gives the next generation of activists that sense that you can succeed and that people have succeeded. And I think that in some ways, the ways in which we do activism changes and should change with every subsequent. I always hate using generation because that's such an artificial construct, but I think every 10 years or so you need to reinvent how you do protest. Mm-hmm. So I think, if you would look at mechanisms that ACT UP used, there are some things that could be relevant, but probably most things wouldn't be relevant. But I think what is relevant is the recognition that the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, the people with some of the least access to positions of power and structures of power fought back and won. And I think that's the true message. And that I think as academics or anyone who's building these collections, if we're elevating the stories of everyday people who became enormous activists, whether it was starting a food bank in their small rural community or starting ACT UP, there's examples, and I think those are really vital, because I think sometimes people think that you have to be that person of that caliber to really make change. Yeah. And what makes change are people deciding that change has to happen and taking action.
Yeah. I mean, Larry Kramer didn't start out just by being Larry Kramer, right? I mean, he kind of worked up to it. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think that the first thing that springs to mind is that many of the things that are oppressing us as queer people still kind of are sometimes received in silos. So if you're a person of colour, it's this as oppression. If you're a trans person, it's this. If you're a woman, if you're a cis gay man, there are all these different things. And I think one of the things that the AIDS epidemic did, and we will keep pulling back to it, was it felt like a bit of a unifier. Mm-hmm. And we saw communities coming together. We saw lesbian women with gay men coming together, understanding the needs of trans people and pulling together because we saw people dying. And I'm going to misquote, but there's a public health specialist and an old activist, he's passed away, Eric Roths, wrote a couple of amazing books, and one of the lines that always struck me was that communities come together when they feel they're in times of crisis and they feel they're in times of struggle. And I think for many of us in our community, we don't feel that because we feel we've had so many wins. You know, you can get married, you can adopt, you can have a nice life. If you want to have a semi-heteronormative kind of life, you can have it. But if you're different, if you're on the outside, and this is why we see the attacks on trans and non-binary people coming to the fore. And I think what we need to recognise as a community in its broadest sense is that if one of us is unwell or being attacked, then we are all unwell and being attacked. And that's a really important thing. I do live with hope that I see a younger generation kind of really finding the ways. So if we look at the Trans March in London every single year, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more political and louder, refuses to take commercial sponsorship and gets out on the streets and does the things and takes some of the tools from ACT UP. And I work with some amazing young queer activists in London who frighten me sometimes because I'm like, wow, you know, you're babies, but they're out there and they're doing the fight. So I'm hopeful, but I still think that, you know, we need to pull those threads together for us to have success. We have a common enemy.
Building on that, I'd say there's so many incredible activists, policymakers, lobbyists. There are good people in lobbying and policymaking as well that are also contributing to these fights. And I don't want to exaggerate the impact that academics can have, because there's a job that we have and a role that we have, and it's not to do someone else's not to do what someone else is doing better than what we could do already, but to join that fight and to amplify and to, well, through our teaching, through our research, bring those stories to the fore. And that's, I mean, this is why an event like this is so great, that discusses why these histories are so important, because they can contribute to those stories. They can contribute to the work of lobbyists, policymakers, informing their decisions, training and teaching students and young people that these are possible. It wasn't that long ago that I was a student where this was not available to me as a student. Just the fact that our students have access to these stories and these histories as valid and valuable, and also the possibility to question what is missing and what is hidden within the histories that we're teaching, already opens up to them an entirely different way of viewing their own lives, their own activism, and how they're going to go into building another future for all of us as well. And I think that I'm excited to see where my students go, because already I'm seeing some of them are going to be world-changing.
Absolutely.
So sort of, not really building on that, my next question is about the COVID-19 pandemic, which was sort of brought up in our conversation, which was about like just the effects of the pandemic and a huge hit for a lot of spaces like bars shutting down, community groups losing connections, and just generally less like LGBT plus spaces now than there were pre-pandemic. So do you think there's a risk here in our ability to like catalogue history, especially oral history, and how do you think COVID-19 is kind of going forward going to affect like the rights and the experiences of LGBT plus communities and kind of collating those responses as a result after the aftermath?
Let's start on that one.
Well, that was one of Molly's and my tasks, was just to preserve those stories. And we, right in the early stages of it, we're like, we know it's coming. We know what's coming, that the voices of our communities are not going to be preserved in the official histories of COVID-19. This was plain as day to us. And we knew that if we didn't do that, that was exactly what was going to happen. And we could moan about it after the fact, or we could do something about it in the present. And fortunately, technologies had evolved such that we could do remote interviews. We had social media to get the word out, connections snowballing into other people. And I think what really surprised me is let me preface that slightly. In oral history projects, it's always a challenge to get participation from the widest diversity of people, because it's about building trust. And that takes a long time to build trust. It might be that a project that you were working on 5 or 10 years ago is something that's now built up trust in communities and demonstrated that you are a responsible, caring researcher, interviewer, partner in these histories, and not an extractive force. So it is long-term, and that's the way it should be. Trust does take time to build. What really surprised me with the COVID-19 pandemic interviews and research that we did, and in part I think this is because we were all going through the same thing at the same, or we were going through the same conditions experienced in very different ways at the same time, but we got such a diversity of people coming forward saying they wanted to tell their stories in ways that I just didn't anticipate that coming forward in quite the same way. But it did allow us to start cataloging across identity positions, across gender identity, across race and ethnicity, across the 4 constituent nations of the UK. Actually, that's the one that I thought was going to be the hardest. Every project we suffer from the inability to sort of get outside the M25 sometimes. So that was really exciting to get that range of voices. The one thing that I think is most important in all of that we've recognized is the impact of COVID-19 on people was related to such a great extent to economic marginalization. And of course that maps onto so many other intersections. Because I am a cis white gay man living in the suburbs of London with a house and a garden. I had space to go outside. I had a partner that I wasn't living alone. But the space to go outside and to be mobile in my environment, I wasn't in a bedroom flat somewhere, a basement flat somewhere, struggling just to see the daylight when there was restrictions on movement because of the cost of living being so high that's what I could afford. I wasn't in shared accommodation with 5, 8 people, other students, other individuals, because of the economic needs to have people living in close proximity, and therefore putting yourself at greater health risk as well. This was the thing that really came through in those interviews, is that question of economic marginalization, and I'm not enough hearing it spoken about in those terms.
And I'm going to speak on a different side of the project, because I think, Justin, you thoroughly covered from the perspective of the people we interviewed. The other part of our project was that we involved our students in actually being interviewers. And what was happening across the world at universities was that research, particularly qualitative research and field research, was just being shut down. Universities were shutting down their IRBs. They were pulling back on research protocols. They were saying you can't do interviews because people can't be associating with one another. And we actually flew through IRB in surprising ways with this project. And what we found to be, I think, really profound was that the students that we involved, because we did our share of interviews, but we also opened up opportunities for students at both of our universities to get involved with this. And it became this relational, valuable tool for our students. You know, our students, regardless of if they were in America or here in the UK, often had lost their queer community when they had to go home and live with their parents again. And so, you know, this gave value to doing queer work for them. It was something they could tell their parents about. And I know my students in the US were just thrilled to get to talk to queer folks in the UK. It you know, at a time when they felt their world was so small, this opened up their world in ways that were quite beautiful. And I think that something we often forget about is the therapeutic value of this kind of research and community building for those who are actually doing the work.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a couple of things for me around COVID and how it links in. Is that, first of all, COVID, as bad as it was and all the impact it had, it provided me personally with an opportunity to do some oral history work, to start producing podcasts and an Instagram account, or curate an Instagram account, because all of my interviews are at home. So it was just easy, it made it so much easier to do that work. But conducting the interviews for We Were Always Here during that first year of the pandemic was highly emotional for a lot of people that I interviewed, because it was a reflection. What it was able for them to do is go, actually, I used these tools back then, so I'm using them now to enable me to survive. And just to wrap up, when your question was around the impact on queer spaces, absolutely huge impact on queer spaces. But I think coming out, and I've seen this through some of the work that I'm doing, it's allowed for people to reimagine what queer space can look like and where it can be, because before it was getting deeply commercialized, run by big companies. And now I'm seeing lots more radical pop-up stuff happening, which is much more inclusive, much more local, local, much more diverse, because, you know, the big firms and who just don't have the appetite to do that anymore. So queer folk are going, actually, let's reimagine this. So there's some real DIY stuff happening on the ground, which I think, again, is a really good thing that came out of it.
Great, thank you so much. So I have quite a lot of questions, but I think I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to give an option to everyone else to ask one. But the institutions that we're part of, like essentially the entire country, is full of like queer history, just because it's history, right? So this LGBT plus History Month, do you have any advice about uplifting the stories that might not make it into the curriculums and might not be discussed as much and entering them into the canon?
I mean, I think starting with talks like this, right, it sounds really simple, but more and more of this, you know, the LGBT History Month isn't a great thing. There's stuff which happens in schools, but similar to other history months that happen, one needs this part of the curriculum throughout the year. And I think it's for folk like us, historians and activists that are on the ground, to be, when we're in these spaces, to be making it a call. You know, I don't want to just do this as a one-off gig. So today I did a talk as part of Lambeth Council, and there were probably about 90 people on the call, as part of their LGBT History Month stuff. But my whole thing, your call to action is, bring me in to talk to your education department. Let's talk about how we can do this. Your work with Queer Britain is really important, but then how do we, I mean, I've done a lot of work with the Barbican and the Tate and a lot of the art institutions in London because of my own profile. But when I'm in that door, it's about me holding that door open for a load of queer people of colour to come rushing in behind me, you know, to start challenging, changing the system that's in there. But it's a lot of work, and it kind of goes back to, I think the decolonising movement is a really interesting example of how the decolonising movement is engaging institutions, particularly artistic and historic institutions, to challenge, not saying get rid of, but reimagine, rethink. And there has been some work, I was listening to a show recently, around queer in exhibitions. So there is some stuff that we need to do to hold that account. And then finally, I'd say there are queer people that work in these institutions. So how are we enabling and empowering our brothers and sisters that work in the V&A to have a voice to be able to challenge? Because very often you may be the only person and you know the system is wrong, but you run risk of being ostracised or losing your job if you make that challenge. So how can we empower and enable and hold people that are in those spaces to do the work that they want to do and we need them to do?
Yeah, and that to me also speaks of the vital importance of allies. And that I think, you know, for those of you who are students, knowing more about the conditions of staff at your university and knowing about the grounds people, like, you know, how comfortable do people feel to be out here? Do they feel that their stories have been represented in meaningful ways? Do they feel like they have any voice as queer people? And I think that, again, those challenges that you speak of are so vital, that when you know, once you're aware of silences and once you see those absences, they just jump out at you. They really, really do. And I think that the more that all of us can be doing that in intersectional ways, so myself as a white woman, I am always looking out for the absence of people of color. And in some ways, I can speak to that more than I can speak to conditions of queerness. Yeah. Because I can be listened to better. And so I think that, you know, really preparing yourself to hear those silences and see those absences and then to use your voice to confront that is vital.
I think that concept of thinking how to embed these histories in the canon is a really interesting approach, because I would say these histories are too important for the canon. I think what we need to do is think outside the canon, think outside the universities, and all these institutions that actually have much greater footfall and much greater impact and much greater access to people who are curious and hungry and want to see this and might not ever want to step inside Goldsmiths, for instance, to find out about it. I'm really inspired by people working in heritage and the work they're doing. But as Mark was saying, they might be the only one in an organization, or they might be fighting their institution to do this work, and the leaders of their institutions might be resisting it and might be putting up obstacles, or there are issues right now, especially around trans histories and trans lives, that are really getting pushback from major heritage institutions. The nearest national museum to us at Goldsmiths is the National Maritime Museum, part of Royal Greenwich Museums, and they've been such a trailblazer about bringing their collections open to and to be influenced by trans youth, and they've done a lot of outreach in that regard to create their collections and their space as a very welcoming, safe place for young people to explore the possibilities of their own lives with the example of the histories that can be discussed there. And you might not have thought of maritime history as being the great possibility for talking about trans youth, but for the better part of a decade, they've been building that up, and they're suffering vicious attacks this month. They've been attacked in the papers. They've been attacked in social media, and this is deeply a problem when they are using the resources of history and the opening discussion that history offers to talk about things in the now and things that are affecting people's well-being and hope and possibilities for the future. And there are those that are trying proactively to shut them down, or they may be shut down out of fear of what worse might come. Mm-hmm. There is the implicit or explicit threats of what's made to institutions that are doing this work. And again, it is, as usual, the most marginalized within our communities that are suffering this the worst. Trans people, queer people of color, more economically marginalized, disability and queerness, all of these. It's well and good to have marriage and whatnot. I've benefited from these things myself, but I'm not the one that's now suffering most under these vicious attacks that are becoming really quite commonplace. And I think that supporting these heritage organizations and the ones that are doing that vitally important work to bring those stories out of the canon and into other spaces is just absolutely essential.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to open it up to the floor if anyone has any questions. Yeah? Yeah.
I've worked in education review.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, and it's one that I think really speaks to how fraught and difficult these efforts can be, and as a reminder that we can be on this stage saying do more of this, and also we have to recognize that these fights can be very difficult, and people can lose their jobs, and people can lose their livelihoods. And I'm reflecting on my experience of where I'm living, which is Ohio. And in the United States, in certain states, there is a real backlash led by conservative politicians, particularly towards education, and really trying to backpedal, not just on LGBT content, but particularly content related to African Americans. And these fights at times are quite vicious. There's a lot of threats that are happening. And I think that some of what I've seen work in some of these school districts has been to really remind stakeholders, that regardless of their positions, that in the case of since we're talking about LGBT, that those kids are there, and those, often you don't say those staff are there, but they are. But to remind them the importance of representing those kids who are part of their community, and that we have enough data out there to show how this can be life-saving, literally life-saving, and that you can try to shift the discourse of, do you want to be responsible for death? Do you want to be responsible for children who self-mutilate themselves? Do you want to be part of this? And that often, and this is why I personally love storytelling, and I think when it comes to political change, when it comes to activism, stories can be so important, because then it isn't the story of people like us on the stage. It's the story of a particular child and a particular situation, and a parent and their story, and to remind people what love and community look like. And I do think that those actions, when you remind people of their core decency, when you remind people of how molecular these conversations really are, that it isn't about politics, it's about survival, that often that does work. But it can take time, and there can be backlash, and there can be struggles. But again, I think so often queer lives and Black lives have become abstractions, political tools. And the more we can do to remind people that these are lives. These are people's lives.
And I think posing that to legislators as well, that they are complicit in those deaths, that harming, that disruption of people's lives, destruction of people's lives, and that there are examples of places where it's done better and where it is embedded in schools. Scotland has legislation requiring LGBTQ plus histories being taught. Earlier, California put that in, and there's all kinds of resources available for that. So it's really key to remember that this isn't some abstract that's never happened before. The wheel is turning, and it's happening in places, and there are examples to cite where it has had profound impact.
And I would just simply add to everything you said there. We talk about the individual lives, but I think there's also something about adding that longer lens to it as well. So I work with men and women who are in their late 20s and early 30s who went to school during Section 28, and the impact that has had and continues to have on the way that they live and engage in the world and see the world. So I think it is absolutely about taking those narratives and that data which says, if you don't do this, this is what happens as a result of that.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah?
This is a really specific question, so feel free to sort of reject it on that basis. But I've been working as an archivist at a student newspaper in Cambridge. I'm trying to write an article on the history of homosexuality in Cambridge as it appears in the news. And there was a really interesting theory in an article from the 90s which suggested that some of the sort of small colleges in Cambridge that took the longest to accept women, so like well into the late 80s, that was because these were spaces for queer men, and that was a factor alongside obviously many others as to why they didn't want women coming into these spaces. I'm finding it very hard to research and write about that, so I was wondering if you had any advice, both sort of because it's quite a complicated, nuanced, I guess, intersectional idea, and also because there are so few sources, like where you might look for sources to try and prove or disprove.
Turning to you on this.
I mean, this sounds fascinating.
It really does. I mean, I know nothing about this, but this sounds great.
I would love to see the research into that. And I mean, of course, there's the history and the present reality of gay misogyny can be part of this as well. And that's something we don't actively talk about, but is definitely a thing that could be part of the story. I would say, with three of us talking about oral history is your way forward. If you can find people who would talk about what happened in some of those colleges, build up relationships with some of them to discuss it further, further, even people that reflect on what they were seeing around them at the time. That would be the way forward, because you're not going to get traditional records going into that. And in fact, finding it's the student newspaper that was writing about this. Was it writing about it in its own time or reflecting further back? So I didn't catch the timeline.
10 years on, it was just a throwaway line.
Right. But those throwaway lines sometimes turn into amazing projects.
Right.
I'm immediately fascinated, and I want you to stay in touch and tell me what you find out.
I know, I think it's a brilliant topic, and I'm wondering too if there might be some memoirs or papers that you could find in the archives, because I think one of the advantages you have at an institution like this is a lot of people did preserve their stories and have their stories preserved, and so might there be some side comments in diaries and other papers that have been preserved.
And actually, there's such a history, so I'm going to go back to it now. You've already won me over. There's such a history, of course, of the queerness of the homosociality of Oxbridge colleges going back to the 19th century, well, beyond. I mean, it's just, there's a high point sort of Hellenism in the 19th century, and then and subsequently there was a great PhD that I was the internal examiner on last year that was looking at male nude bathing in Oxford, and the link between Parsons Pleasure, which the space was called, and the life of the colleges. I mean, there's just so much that gives you background into the very unique and fascinating experience of single gender spaces in across Cambridge and Oxford, but in this system.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you remember a specific moment when you knew that this was kind of the career path you wanted to go down, or did it kind of unfold over time?
Let's go. I mean, in terms of kind of researching, curating history, mine was purely by accident. I mean, lockdown, COVID, I was saying upstairs, age played a factor into it. I became an older man in my community, so lots of younger people that I was mentoring or around started to ask me lots of questions, and I realised that we needed to find a way to tell these stories. And I think also around the HIV narrative, in around 2021, there was a lot of commemoration of 40 years of the pandemic, and I kept seeing these stories come out, and every single time I would go to an event, I would either be the only person of colour along with maybe one or two women, and one of those would probably be one woman of colour and one white woman, and I was going, this isn't right. And so being an activist, I wanted to do something about it. So it was age, accident, and a kind of need to fill a gap.
I think for me as well, activism was really central. I was an activist as an undergraduate, and when I particularly got involved with ACT UP and HIV, realizing just the importance of the moment, and then I got into filmmaking and really recognized just how many really awesome stories there were out there. Whether it was talking to sex workers or drag queens or civil rights activists, or whatever community I would find to do a film about, I just realized that there was so much out there, and that when I became a professor, I didn't want to give up what I found to be not only professionally rewarding, but personally rewarding. I mean, there's nothing more wonderful than just sitting down and having chats with people and finding out the lush lives people live. And I'm reflecting back on what you were saying about that often the stories are told in terms of the dark elements of it. And I think I had probably more fun during my time as an ACT UPper than many other subsequent time periods of my life. Yes, we were dying, but we also were just loving each other and celebrating each other and having so much fun. And I think that activism can be fun and should be fun. and otherwise you're going to burn out. And so I think that, I wanted to maintain that activism as a scholar.
Absolutely.
Which can be a bad word.
I would say I'm sitting here due to a remarkable number of complete accidents, unexpected possibilities, no intentionality for many of those years to end up being a queer historian. Not least because when I started my post at Goldsmiths in 2017, as far as I'm aware, I was then the only person in a university in the UK whose remit was entirely queer history. There's a couple others now. We're still few and far between, but at the time, that was the only post in the country named for queer history. So I didn't expect to have that possibility because I'd never heard of that happening before. But even getting into queer history as the focus of my career and my work was completely accidental. I studied a range of other things and other possibilities. I studied languages, I studied business. I came drawn back to history and not to queer history. I was interested in gender and sexuality. I looked at women's history for a while as the area that I was working in because that was, at that time, gender history meant studying women. And I'm like, I love gender, I'm going to work on this. And gravitated actually by the sources. I encountered sexuality, I encountered queer history, I encountered sources it wasn't until my PhD actually, after having had an entire project approved and defended, that I came to the UK to do my research, emailed my committee and said, I'd kind of like to change that, is that okay? And changed it entirely on the basis of just finding some sources that I couldn't explain. I didn't understand why some of these publications from the 30s looked so queer, and no one had ever taught me why that was the case. And so I decided to write about that, and that became my first published article. But all of it has just been a completely haphazard series of accidents that brought me through that specific path, and not another that would have been, I think, still about working with people, working with stories, maybe with history, maybe with more something more journalistic, maybe with something else. But I joke with my students that it's really only the last few years that I've really, I think, confirmed to myself what I want to be when I grow up.
Great, thank you so much. Do we have any final questions? Oh.
So a lot of the time, queer history, LGBT history is like the box in the textbook, that's kind of like up at the top, or like the one panel in LGBT history month that's in a museum, right? Like, if you're lucky, clearly not in the case of Duxford. And so, like, we talk a lot about like how to integrate all those sorts of things, and all those questions are really important. And highlighting, this month is LGBT History Month is really important. But my question is, like, can we flip that and think about how much queering history could actually make the whole discipline better? Like, so not just sort of inserting queer people into the story that we already know, but queering history itself. And what that could do. So if you reflect on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I feel very strongly in agreement with that sentiment, and I feel obstructed in doing that by the mechanisms and systems of the academy in Britain. I find that it is too often designed to prevent useful change. And I've really struggled with that. That has been my biggest professional frustration, annoyance, hardship, that I am permitted to teach my classes that are queer. I have the MA, but I don't know how much that's doing to change my department, my institution. I am the little box in several contexts. I think we really need to agitate the systems in which we're working, because if we did change these systems in academia to be more open to change, more open to possibility, more open to different kinds of assessments, more open to different kinds of marking and grading, and including students in designing modules and assessments that relate to their lives and experiences in proactive and productive ways, it would do wonders, not just for queer history, but every other marginalized history that we are, by design, inadequately teaching still. So I know we're entirely in agreement, and our battle is with our employers and with the systems that hired us in for very specific reasons that we now have to dismantle.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and I think that so often, as you know, Julia, those of us doing this work are the ones banging our heads against the doors of our administration, and there's something so vital about, like, I'm much more into queer methods than I am queer theory, and when I'm approaching my graduate students, I don't care what the subject is. It's like, look at these queer methods, because they disrupt, they challenge, and they're useful tools regardless of what you're studying. It's an approach, it's a way of thinking. It isn't about LGBT lives. And I think that the more that we can be working within our structures, and I've been finding, fortunately, more and more of my colleagues at my university who are straight identified, many of whom are very well-established scholars in their field, that are coming to me to be like, how can we introduce queer methods and queer theory into architecture, into all of these other disciplines, and that really excites me, because I think that that's one way for change to happen. And then, I know, talking to Justin, that it's easier to change curriculum in the US than it is here. And so that was my other approach. That's why I created LGBT Studies, and all of that was to really just start pushing it through the curriculum and make it be part of core classes that students have to take, and all of that. But I know that's a lot harder to do here.
I burst with laughter because I am quite literally a box in a Key-S stage, I think 13-year-old history book on social history, and there's a little picture of me and the HIV epidemic, and I'm like, oh, I am the little box. So it's been ticked, it's black, it's queer, it's HIV, it's all there. I'm not a historian, I'm an activist, and I'm a grassroots person, and I think there is something around, there's a couple of things for me. One, linking institutions with the activists, with the people on the ground, with the grassroots, to influence that change. And it's wonderful that, Molly's an activist as well, and bringing that into academia. But I think ultimately for me, I kind of look at our history, or the teaching of history, as a meal. And we're not giving our students, we're not giving our young people the full meal. And I went to school in this country, and I learned nothing about Black history, and I'm really, really grateful that my grandchildren are starting to learn that because of the work. I'm hopeful that queer history will intersect with that, and so they get the full course that they absolutely deserve, because I think ultimately the world that we exist in is that historic world. And when you step out in the world, if you're only getting the starter, you're not prepared for the rest of the stuff that's going to come after.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your contributions today. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciated it. I learned a lot. I think everyone else in the audience did too.
As did I.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.